All right, welcome back. We're going to go over the note sheet for, lesson 4. So if you want to grab that, and we will fill that out real quick, give you the answers, and then we'll jump into the U-boat war and the air war, Battle of the Atlantic and the air war, which will be Module 5, Lecture 5. All right, for Pacific War and Japanese Conquest, Lecture 4, the note sheet, the answers are, and I'm going to give you the answers only instead of reading the whole sentence for sake of time. So number 1, the China incident. Number 2, tripartite pact. Number 3, General Douglas MacArthur. Number 4, Hideki Tojo. Number 5, Isoroku Yamamoto. You can look on the slide or look on the internet on how to spell his name. Number 6, Chuichi Nagumo. Same thing. Look it up if you need to. Number 7, Orange. 8, Naval Expansion Act. Number 9, Southern Resources Area. Number 10, Repulse. Number 11, Germany First. 12, Bataan Peninsula. 13, Major General Edward P. King. 14, Bushido. 15, Camp O'Donnell. 16, Wainwright, Jonathan Wainwright. 17, Doolittle and Hornet. 18, Battle of the Coral Sea. 19, Lexington. 20, U.S. Code Breakers. 21, MacArthur. 22, Solomon. 23, Airfield. 24, Watchtower. 25, Henderson. 26, Savo. 27, Bloody Ridge. 28, Sergeant John Basilone. 29, Gilbert. 30, Tarawa. 31, Jagged Coral Reefs. 32, Marshall. 33, Saipan. 34, Forager and B-29. 35, 4. 36, Peleliu. 37, Turkey Shoot. And number 38, Sulphur Island. So those are the answers to the lesson 4 note sheet. Now we're going to go through lesson 5. So grab your slides and get them ready. Battle of the Atlantic and the Air War. The Battle of the Atlantic and the Air War. Slide 2, if I could sum up the Battle of the Atlantic in a few words, I would describe it as a microcosm of technological ingenuity or innovation. And the reason I say that is because the U-boat war introduced some innovative technologies, some advances that might otherwise never have been developed had there not been a Battle of the Atlantic. Next slide. Battle of the Atlantic primarily involved Great Britain and Germany, and although the United States was partially involved, as we'll see shortly, the Battle of the Atlantic was the longest running battle of World War II. It began just a few days after Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939, and it ended with the last U-boat that surrendered in May of 1945. Of course, as you probably guessed, the Battle of the Atlantic was a naval battle, a naval clash, and the prize was dominance of the Atlantic Ocean. Simply put, whoever controlled the Atlantic would win the war. Now, if we were in class together, I would take some time to discuss this with you and kind of go around the room and ask your opinion. We could generate some great crosstalk here. But think about that, how I could make such a statement. Whoever controlled the Atlantic would win World War II. Well, if Germany had been able to win the Battle of the Atlantic, they could have prevented merchant shipping, ships that carried equipment, tanks, oil, gasoline, food, etc., from North America to Great Britain and even Russia. Once President Roosevelt instituted the Lend-Lease Act, that's what gave the United States the mandate to begin supplying our allies, even before we got in the war, with equipment, with much needed resources. But if the Germans could have sunk and won that battle, sunk all those ships, then they would have Great Britain would have been starved out, and Russia would have never have received the massive amounts of trucks that we sent to them, and so forth. And also, there would have been no place in England to have staged the D-Day landings if Britain would have lost and surrendered to the Germans. Next slide. So by way of introduction, no study of naval warfare is complete without mentioning this guy right here. Alfred Thayer Mahan, one of the greatest naval theorists in all time. And he wrote a book known as The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. And in that book, he wrote, quote, "The dominant element in naval warfare was a large, or is a large, powerful battle fleet." Now, when I say that, large, powerful battle fleet, I'm talking about a surface fleet. I'm talking about carriers, battleships, corvettes, cruisers, destroyers, etc. I'm not talking about submarines. But he said, the dominant element in naval warfare is a large, powerful battle fleet able to knock out the enemy fleet and blockade its harbors, to either starve it out or deny it access to the open sea. Next slide. So those that read Mahan's book and took it to heart, naval theorists, planners, leaders, and so forth, began the opening of the 20th century with the battleship race. They took Mahan's writings to heart and decided that we need to build a powerful surface fleet. And so the British won that race, that battleship race, in 1906, with the introduction of the HMS Dreadnought, which all the other world's navies tried to copy. Next slide. The German Navy was known as the Kriegsmarine. The Kriegsmarine from 1935 to 1945. It replaced the Imperial German Navy of the Great War. And you'll recall that one of the stipulations from the Treaty of Versailles was that Germany was limited to limit the size of their navy. They were also forbidden to design or construct submarines, aircraft carriers, naval aircraft, or heavy coastal artillery. Of course, when Hitler became Chancellor in January of 1933, he ignored this and did it anyway. And he authorized a thing called Plan Z. Excuse me 1 minute. Or Plan Z, which was kind of analogous to President Roosevelt's Naval Expansion Act of 1940. And Plan Z, or the Z Plan, called for the construction of about 300 or so ships during a period from 1939 until 1948. And the Germans never got close to those numbers. They got pretty close with their U-boats and so forth, but the Plan Z was mainly for surface ships. And when World War II began, they only had 57 surface ships, and the Royal Navy had 300, so there was quite a disparity. And so to make up for that, they had to make U-boats, and that's what they did. So I'd like you to, and you don't have to do it right now, but sometime during this week, watch the video that I've included in Canvas on the Z Plan. It's about a 10-minute video. Next slide. So as World War II began, the German surface fleet embarked upon a strategy of commerce raiding to destroy or disrupt the logistics of the enemy on the open sea by attacking its merchant shipping rather than engaging its surface fleet. Now, remember, Mahan advocated the reverse, that you should attack the surface fleet rather than commencing with commerce raiding. But the German surface fleet decided to do that, and that was the decision of their admiral, a man by the name of Erich Raeder. Now, commerce raiding proved moderately effective, but it was expensive. It was expensive for the British because they lost merchant shipping, but it was also expensive for the Germans because they lost some truly remarkable capital ships, surface vessels. In fact, some naval authorities argue that the entire surface effort on the part of the Kriegsmarine was nothing more than a vast and costly diversion, and that the money and the men and the blood, sweat, and tears that would have been better served if they would have invested in building as many submarines or as many U-boats as they possibly could have. That argument gets stronger when you consider a quote from Winston Churchill when he said that, quote, "The only thing that ever frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." So commerce raiding, heavily criticized by Mahan, he regarded it as a distraction from the destruction of the enemy surface fleet. But nevertheless, commerce raiding was an important part of Germany's naval strategy during the early part of the war, and it ended up costing Admiral Raeder his job. And then when Hitler fired him, he replaced him with Karl Dönitz. who became the new admiral, who was a former U-boat skipper during the Great War, and who took the U-boat threat to heart, the U-boat war to heart. So, next slide. Speaking of, the undersea boat, the Unterseeboot or U-boat submarine, when you think of the Battle of the Atlantic, if you have any knowledge of it at all, you're going to instantly think of the U-boat war. When Germany declared war in 1939, they immediately began employing their U-boats. In fact, on the very day Hitler invaded Poland, September the 3rd, the German U-30 sank the SS Athenia, a British passenger liner. Now, unlike Great Britain, who built about 190 submarines during World War II, the Kriegsmarine built and launched 1,134 U-boats during the war. And so what follows during the Battle of the Atlantic becomes a contest of who can one-up who. Now, next slide. Both sides experienced some advantages as well as disadvantages, and I want to point these out. First, among the advantages for the Kriegsmarine would have been geography. And this advantage was definitely with the Germans. After Germany conquered France in the summer of 1940, they immediately began building and basing their submarines along the Atlantic coast of France, the North Atlantic coast of France, in places like Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, and so forth. And if you look at the little slide, the map there, you'll see that the U-boat bases are strung all along these areas of France. And this was great because it allowed Germany, they didn't have far to travel at all to get out to the hunting area of the North Atlantic, because their bases were already in the North Atlantic. So this was a great advantage geographically for these U-boat squadrons or U-boat flotillas. Next slide. Another advantage was in the manner in which U-boats were assigned to specific areas of the Atlantic. This was really a genius system, their tactical employment. And so headquarters U-boats would transmit via the Enigma system, a secret coded message system, to these U-boat commanders a particular grid coordinate of where they wanted them to patrol. Next slide. So this is a picture of an actual U-boat chart, and right over my shoulder there's an actual U-boat chart from a U-boat that I've got stuck up on my wall there. And so, and if we're in class together, I would bring this in and show it to you. And so, basically this U-boat chart was a chart that divided up the entire ocean into 536 square sectors. And each sector was given a two-letter designation. Next slide. So each two-letter sector was further subdivided into a 9 sub-square matrix, a 3x3 9 sub-square matrix, so that there were 9 medium squares numbered the same way as you would on your smartphone keypad. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 at the bottom. And this slide depicts this as sector DG, which is west of Morocco, Africa. The 9 squares within sector DG were again divided into 9 smaller squares. Next slide. This was known as a grid, so that there were now 81 total grid quadrants within a given sector, numbered similarly as the sectors were. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just like a smartphone keypad. And so only the first of the two numbers corresponds to the grid number, hence 61, 62, 63, etc. So that tells us to look in grid 6 of sector DG. And when we do, we find the particular grid coordinate is identified with a 2-digit quadrant numbered 63. So DG 63. So the complete grid system would now have 2 alphabetic characters and 2 digits, forming a 4-character grid coordinate. Sector DG, quadrant 63. I know it's a little bit confusing, but if you're looking at the chart, it makes sense. Finally, the 2 numbered quadrants were further divided down to identify the actual patrol zone that the commander was to patrol. And that was usually an area that was about 6 nautical miles across. So when we zoom in on quadrant 63 on the slide there, or our map, we again discover the same number system. Only this time, the middle number of each of the 9 subsections represents the 3rd number, and the final number, marked with the red X, represents the actual 6 nautical mile zone. So, to put it all together, grid coordinate DG6397 would tell the U-boat skipper or commander exactly what 6-mile area he was to patrol. All right, next slide. Another advantage were these massive U-boat bases or pens that housed and protected the U-boats. And these were massive concrete reinforced structures which basically were designed to shield the U-boats in case of any kind of an aerial bombardment. They were like bomb-proof garages. Since Hitler took Norway during Operation Weserübung in April of 1940, the Germans were also able to send U-boats out through the Norwegian Sea, and that enabled them to attack Lend-Lease convoys that were coming from America up over the port of Murmansk in Russia. Next couple slides, the Allies also began the Battle of the Atlantic with some advantages. All the advantages didn't go to the Germans. For example, to counteract the U-boat threat, the British just kind of dusted off and reinstituted their convoy system that they used during the Great War. By the way, the British were the first to develop the convoy system during the War of the Spanish Succession, when French ships would raid British ships, merchant ships. The convoy system basically involved placing a large number of ships, usually merchant ships that were carrying fuel or oil, other commodities, and those are represented by those black shapes on the slide, placing them and surrounding them with warships represented by the red shapes. So each ship of the convoy would have its designated place in the convoy position, and the whole thing would sail together with the lead convoy ship in the front, and the lead ship would travel at the speed of the slowest ship. Next slide. Protecting and escorting these convoys were these floating bodyguards called destroyers or corvettes, cruisers. They would sail on the outskirts of the convoy, and as the convoy would make its way to its destination, the convoy commander would periodically issue orders if he suspected that U-boats were in the vicinity. He would order the convoy to zigzag its course, and that would throw off the enemy tracking devices. Now remember, radar was just coming into use, and most vessels, especially submarines, relied on sound ranging or sonar with a device called a hydrophone. Next slide. Another vessel the Allies used were patrol crafts, or sub-chasers, as my grandfather called them. And these 173-foot wooden vessels were designed primarily to hunt and destroy enemy submarines. Patrol craft were highly effective in protecting convoys, as well as patrolling the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. Here's a picture on this slide. Speaking of my grandfather, this is my grandfather, William Parrott, and the patrol craft that he served on, PC-481, during World War II. Next slide. From July 1940 until the end of that year, the Germans enjoyed some huge success in sinking over 630 enemy ships. In October of 1940, the Germans scored their first major propaganda victory of the Battle of the Atlantic when the U-47, commanded by U-boat skipper Gunther Prien, snuck into the British base at Scapa Flow off the coast of Scotland and sunk the pride of the British Navy, the HMS Royal Oak battleship. More than 800 British sailors perished, and Prien was awarded, he was the first U-boat commander of the war to be awarded the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross, which is sort of like our Congressional Medal of Honor. Next slide. Over the course of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat war would take center stage in German publicity. Crowds of onlookers would gather at U-boat bases to welcome these returning U-boats and their crews. And if the U-boat was successful and had sunk the required tonnage, a broom would often be seen affixed to the conning tower, which would indicate a clean sweep of enemy shipping. Uniquely designed U-boat pennants, like this one, this is an actual one from the war, would indicate that this particular submarine, and this was the insignia or analogous to nose art on an aircraft, the U-96 was this submarines. This indicated that they had sunk 4,150 tons with this pennant, indicating that. And so it was not uncommon for, a string of these pennants to be all along the deck of the submarine as they sailed back into the U-boat base. Next slide. And as they sailed back into their base, there would be an orchestra waiting for them, ladies tossing flowers at them. And these guys, these U-boat crews and commanders were kind of really rock stars, if you will, of the German military. And the reason for that was because submarine warfare was so dangerous. If anything went wrong while you're down there submerged under the water, there's not a whole lot the crew could do, not a whole lot you can do. It's not like you can open a window and swim right out to the surface. And so what the typical U-boat patrol was characterized by long periods of boredom interrupted by brief moments of terror. Next slide. The conditions inside a submarine were horrendous, less than ideal. It was extremely cramped. Men had to share bunks. There was one toilet for 48 guys. And after a month or so on patrol, the food would get pretty moldy. It would start to putrefy. It was generally a very unpleasant experience. Now, next slide. When a U-boat would encounter an enemy convoy, things would get very exciting. Torpedoes would be launched at enemy ships. But that would be the fun part, I guess, in a way, for the crew. They're finally getting to do what they were trained for. But after they would launch those torpedoes, it was on. Okay, the surface ships that would be hunting them, destroyers, for example, or patrol craft, would then turn on their active sonar and begin looking for that submarine that had just sunk a merchant ship or had just fired a torpedo maybe at them. And so this would become this cat and mouse game as the submarine would try to hide while the destroyer would look for it. Next slide. And so to help better hide, the U-boat would typically rig their submarine for what was called silent running. That would be all crewmen were to stop talking. Nobody was to make any noise. You had to whisper. And the reason for that was because the enemy up on the top, on the surface, were listening in. They were using radar and sonar to try to pick up the location of the enemy submarine. And so U-boats would use passive sonar to listen for the sound of the propeller screws that would tell them what kind of a ship it was, or it would tell them how close it was. But it would also tell them the proximity of their location. And so they would use this sound, and the reason I keep looking down is I'm pulling this up on my iPhone so I can give you a demonstration of what this sounded like. And so when they would go to silent running, the guys on the submarine, they're terrified. The submarine is bathed in a red light so that no white light would be emitted from the periscope if it were above the surface. All the lights are off. All the guys have to be quiet. The engines are probably stopped. And here's what they're listening for. So this is known as a ping. And so this sound, these guys on the submarine, imagine yourself being on this sub. It's dark, you're scared out of your mind, it stinks, and all you can hear is this. This is the sound that the sonarman is transmitting through the sub, so it lets them know the location of that enemy vessel looking for them. Now, as the sound gets quicker, as the ping starts to accelerate, that would indicate that the destroyer or whatever enemy ship's looking for them is close to them. And what they don't want is for depth charges to be launched. Depth charges were these like trash can sized cans filled with explosives that had a dial on the depth charge that the person arming it could set it for 100 meters, 175 meters, 300 meters, wherever they determined the submarine location to be. And if they exploded really close to the submarine, it could cause the pressure hull to rupture, which would then implode the submarine, destroying it and killing everybody on board. And the only way that the surface ship would know that is if they could see debris floating on top of the surface, oil, dead bodies, debris from the submarine, etc. Next slide. So during the first half of 1941, German U-boats sank over 700 British ships. And this was known as the first happy time. And so to counter this, the British used what were called Q ships, or decoys, which were really heavily armed ships disguised as merchant ships. So the German U-boats would surface. The skipper would walk up, out of the conning tower, and he would put his binoculars on, and he would begin to look around, and he would see a merchant ship and think, "Wow, this is a sitting duck for us." And rather than wasting a torpedo, they would get the deck gun ready, and most submarines carried a deck gun, and so they would arm the deck gun, and they would get ready to blast that merchant ship and sink it, only to discover that the guys on the deck of the Q ship who were watching the submarine through their binoculars would take off these covers. They would uncover these hidden guns, swivel them around, aim them at the U-boat, and begin to fire and hopefully destroy the U-boat. And so this worked for a while, but U-boats commanders eventually got wise to it. It's just like if you, at our house, we bought one of these, and you can get them at Lowe's or Home Depot, and some of you know what I'm talking about. These owls, right? These fake owls, and you put them on your roof, and it's designed to discourage sparrows and other birds that would like to nest on, leave a little dropping on your house to discourage that. Well, we bought one, and it worked for about a week, and then the birds got wise to it and figured out this isn't a real owl. This is phony. We're going to just keep messing up this guy's patio, and so that was kind of how Q ships worked. It worked. It fooled the Germans worked for a while, for a little while, but then the Germans began to just stay submerged to launch their torpedo attacks. The British relied heavily on aircraft to counter the U-boat threat, and this was really the most effective means of anti-submarine warfare. In fact, once the British had radar, the days of U-boats sailing on the surface at all were pretty much done. Speaking of U-boats and U-boat skippers, I want to show you something in my personal collection at home. This is something very valuable to me. It's an actual U-boat commander's visor cap from World War II. You can see that it's pretty dirty and filthy, pretty gnarly. It's been it's 70-some years old. But this particular hat, the only person on board the U-boat that would wear this was the skipper, the commander. So he's the only one with a white hat. The rest of them would be blue. And somewhere in here I've got one of those too, one of the crew hats. But anyway, this white cotton cover was used to cover the fabric of the hat to protect the U-boat hat from sea spray and debris and oil and so forth. So anyway, I wanted to show you that. Okay, I am going to stop the video right here. We're at about 27 minutes, and we'll pick it up on slide 27.